She never expected her life to change inside an elevator. He never expected to meet someone who would make him question everything. But the moment they were trapped together, something began to shift. Not just the walls around them, but something deeper. Gabriel Moretti had everything: wealth, status, power. He was the only son of Lorenzo Moretti, the ruthless CEO of Moretti Enterprises. The kind of man whose name opened doors, whose money silenced questions, and whose empire ruled over hundreds of lives. Gabriel was young, polished, and Harvard-educated, the next in line for the throne. Yet behind his tailored suits and sharp jawline, there was something empty. He walked the marble floors of his father's company like a ghost in a castle he never asked to inherit. Every step he took had already been planned for him. Every word, rehearsed. Every relationship, strategic. On the opposite end of that world was Isabella da Costa. She arrived at the Moretti building long before the sun came up. She wasn't seen, not really. She cleaned fingerprints off glass doors and polished chrome elevator buttons. She made the office shine before the executives stepped out of their luxury cars. Her life was built on silence, invisible labor, long hours, and dreams she no longer dared to speak out loud. She had grown used to the way people looked through her, but she never stopped looking at them, observing, listening, wondering what it felt like to live on the other side of the glass. That morning started like any other. Gabriel entered through the private entrance, checking his watch, already annoyed by the traffic. Isabella had just finished mopping the 27th floor and was heading down in the service elevator. At 9:14 a.m., the building experienced a brief but critical power failure. Most systems recovered within seconds. But 3 elevators were thrown off course. By pure coincidence, or something more, Gabriel and Isabella ended up in the same service elevator. An outdated, narrow lift at the far end of the building. At first, they didn't even look at each other. Gabriel was scrolling through his phone. Isabella stood quietly beside her cleaning cart, eyes down, hands folded. The elevator stopped. He pressed the emergency button. Nothing. He pressed it again harder. Still nothing. He sighed, frustrated. Great. That's when he finally looked up and saw her. She met his eyes, but didn't speak. It was the kind of silence that asked permission to exist. He asked, "You okay?" She nodded. "Are you?" He hesitated, then gave a short, dismissive answer. "Fine." The silence returned, heavier than before. He asked who she was. She answered simply, "Isabella. I clean the 27th floor." He raised an eyebrow. "Janitorial?" "Cleaning staff," she replied calmly. Something about her tone made him pause. She wasn't defensive, just real. He leaned against the wall. "Looks like we're stuck," she nodded. "Looks like it." Another pause. "You don't seem very panicked," he said. "I've been stuck before," she answered, "in places that took longer to get out of." That made him look at her again. For reasons he didn't understand, he found himself saying, "I hate elevators." Not because of the space, because of the stillness. She tilted her head. "Why?" "It makes me think too much." She nodded slowly. Stillness can be dangerous like that. A few minutes passed. He spoke again. "So, what do you do when you're not cleaning floors?" She smiled. "Try to stay awake. Try to stretch what little money I have until the end of the week. Try to find 5 minutes of peace." He gave a dry laugh. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, still smiling. He looked at her more carefully now. There was something about her, not her clothes, not her job, but her presence. Unshaken, grounded. She asked, "And what do you do when you're not in a suit?" He looked away. "Try to remember who I was before I became someone I didn't choose to be." For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Then he added, My father runs this company, and someday I'm supposed to take his place. Do you want to? No. Then why will you? Because people like me don't say no. She nodded, slowly. There was no judgment in her face, just understanding. He sank to the floor, resting his elbows on his knees. I've met 1,000 people in this building. No one ever talks like you do. Maybe because they don't see you. They just see your name. He looked up at her. And you? I see a man stuck in a box. Just like me. The hours passed slowly. The intercom sparked once, but the voice was unclear. They were told help was coming, but no timeline was given. And yet, something strange happened. They stopped waiting. They started talking about their childhoods, their fears, the people they pretended to be. She told him about her mother, who cleaned houses until her hands gave out. He told her about the first time he saw his father fire someone without blinking. They shared regrets and quiet laughter. For the first time in a long time, Gabriel didn't feel like the Moretti heir. He just felt human. She asked, "What scares you most?" He answered without hesitation, "Being like my father." Then he asked, "What about you?" "Losing myself just to survive." When the lights finally flickered back on, it wasn't a relief. It was a warning. Their moment was ending. As the elevator doors began to open, he stood and looked at her. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked. She gave him a sad smile. "I believe in timing." Outside the elevator stood Lorenzo Moretti. His eyes landed on Isabella like a spotlight, cold, calculating. Gabriel instinctively stepped in front of her. "This is Isabella," he said firmly. Lorenzo's voice was sharp. "We'll talk about this later." Security and technicians rushed forward. The world returned. But something in Gabriel stayed behind. Something had changed, and he wasn't sure he wanted to go back. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but restless beneath Gabriel's skin. He returned to his routine. Boardroom meetings, financial projections, morning briefings led by men twice his age who still feared his last name. But every face blurred into the next. Every conversation felt hollow, because in the back of his mind, one remained vivid. Isabella. He didn't even know her last name then. Only her voice, her eyes, the strange comfort of being seen in a way no one had dared to see him before. Lorenzo, however, had not forgotten either. He summoned Gabriel into his office, just 2 days after the elevator incident. A room of glass and steel, overlooking the city like a throne above the clouds. Lorenzo stood behind his desk, arms crossed. "So," he began, "you've made a new friend." Gabriel didn't respond. Lorenzo continued, "Let's be clear, son. That girl, that woman, is not part of our world. She was kind," Gabriel said evenly, "and real. 2 things you've forgotten how to be." Lorenzo's jaw tensed. "You're young, you're bored. But don't confuse pity for attraction." "I'm not confused," Gabriel replied. "You are. You think money separates people by value. It doesn't. It only separates those who've forgotten where they came from." "You listen to me," Lorenzo snapped. "One day this company will be yours. That means your image, your alliances, your future. They're not just personal. They're strategic. You don't get to fall for a cleaning woman like this is a fairy tale." Gabriel stood up. "Maybe I don't want your empire if it costs me my soul." He walked out, but the echo of his father's words followed him. Isabella, meanwhile, had returned to her duties quietly. No one mentioned the elevator. No one asked about her time with Gabriel, but she noticed the difference. Security followed her more closely now. Supervisors were colder. One day her schedule changed without warning. Another, her locker was emptied without notice. She didn't need to be told what was happening. She was being erased, silently, efficiently, and completely. But she didn't regret it, not a second of it, even if it was brief, even if it would never happen again. Still, one afternoon, as she pushed her cart past the executive wing, she heard his voice. "Isabella." She turned. Gabriel was standing alone, tie loosened, eyes tired but alive. "I only have a minute," he said. "But I had to see you." She looked around nervously. "You shouldn't be here. They're watching you." "They always are," he said. "But I don't care." He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a piece of paper with an address and a time. "Meet me there tonight," he said. "Please." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I haven't been able to breathe since we left that elevator." That night, she stood outside a small rooftop cafe in the old part of town. Not flashy, not expensive, just quiet. Real. He was waiting there, holding 2 cups of coffee. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them now felt like a language. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. About her favorite books, his childhood fear of thunderstorms, the smell of his mother's old garden before she passed, the time she snuck into a museum just to stare at paintings she couldn't name. And somewhere between stories and smiles, they stopped pretending the world outside didn't exist. They kissed. It was gentle, uncertain, but true. And for a moment, everything else faded. But moments don't last forever. Lorenzo found out within days. He wasn't just angry. He was threatened. His son had become vulnerable, and worse, disobedient. He sent a private investigator to Isabella's neighborhood, made calls to have her blacklisted from other cleaning companies, found out her mother owed hospital bills and offered to pay them in exchange for her resignation. But Isabella didn't take the bait. She stayed, and Gabriel, despite warnings, kept seeing her. In hidden parks, on quiet benches, in parking garages under false names. It wasn't just rebellion. It was salvation. But the higher the stakes, the colder the world became. One night, Gabriel entered his father's office unannounced. "You want control?" he asked. "Fine, but I'm not a puppet. I won't live by your rules anymore." Lorenzo stood calmly, hands clasped. "I've given you everything," he said. "No," Gabriel replied. "You gave me chains wrapped in gold." Lorenzo stepped closer. "This girl, this fantasy, it'll destroy you?" Gabriel's voice didn't shake. "Then let it." Later that night, Isabella received a letter at her door. No return address, just one line inside. "Stay away from Gabriel. For your safety." She knew what it meant, what it threatened. But she went to meet him anyway. When he saw her, his face lit up. Then he saw the letter in her hand, and his expression changed. "They're trying to scare you," he said. "They already have," she admitted. He reached for her hand. "We can leave, start over. Anywhere. I'll walk away from all of it." She looked into his eyes. "I want to believe you," she said. "But people like you don't get to disappear." "I'm not like him," Gabriel whispered. "I never was." And then, softly, she said, "Then prove it." He wanted to prove it, not with promises, not with grand gestures, but with truth. So the next morning, Gabriel made a decision. He walked into the boardroom where the company's top executives sat waiting, files open, screens glowing. It was a meeting scheduled weeks in advance, but today he didn't follow the agenda. He stood at the head of the table, tall, unshaken, but different. "I've asked you all here to announce something," he said. The room stilled. "I won't be taking over Moretti Enterprises." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the directors leaned forward. "Gabriel, this isn't a joke. Your father—" "My father built this company on control," Gabriel interrupted. "But I won't live the same way." Murmurs broke out. One man stood up. "This company is your future." "No," Gabriel said. It's his past. And just like that, he walked out, leaving behind the legacy everyone expected him to carry. He drove straight to Isabella. She was standing outside her building, holding a box of her belongings. They had fired her. Not just fired, erased her. Severed her badge, canceled her ID, and marked her as a security risk. He stepped out of the car, saw the box, and stopped. "They made sure I couldn't work anywhere else," she said softly. His fists clenched. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She shook her head. "You didn't do this. They did." "I left the company," he said. She looked up. "You what?" "I told them I won't be CEO. I'm done." She blinked. "You really did it?" He nodded. "Because I meant what I said. I want a life that's mine, not his." She looked at the box in her arms. "I don't know where I'll go," she said. "I don't have much left." He stepped closer. "Then we'll figure it out together." And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. They moved into a small apartment above a bookstore in a quiet neighborhood far from the business district. No marble floors, no private elevators. Just wooden stairs, leaky faucets, and a window that faced the morning sun. Gabriel took a job at a local nonprofit that helped youth from underprivileged communities learn business skills. He traded tailored suits for rolled-up sleeves, power lunches for cafeteria trays. He started from scratch, not to prove anything to the world, but to find himself. Isabella started painting again. It was something she'd done as a child, but had buried long ago beneath work and responsibility. Now, with a quiet room and a few borrowed brushes, she began to bring her colors back to life. They lived simply. And for a while, they were happy. But peace has a way of disturbing those who thrive on control. Lorenzo was not done. He sent lawyers with documents. He sent men with offers. He even staged a media scandal, planting a false story about Isabella stealing from the Moretti company before she was terminated. The headline spread fast. "CEO's son falls for maid who robbed him." Gabriel was furious. He tried to fight it legally, but the machine was too big. The media was already in motion. Rumors were fuel, and Isabella was their fire. She refused to leave the apartment for days. Gabriel tried to comfort her, but he could see the fear growing behind her eyes. "They want to break us," he said. "But they won't win." "I've fought my whole life just to be allowed to exist," she whispered. "And now they're trying to erase me like I was never real." He held her face in his hands. "You are real. More than any of them." But words couldn't stop the pressure. Their rent went up suddenly. Inspectors came knocking. The bookstore below was suddenly fined and threatened with closure. Anyone who helped them faced quiet consequences. One night, as they sat on the floor of their apartment, eating cheap takeout in silence, Isabella looked at him and asked, "Do you regret it?" Gabriel looked at her. "No, not even for a second." She leaned against him. "Then let's stop surviving." "What do you mean?" "Let's leave, not just the company. The city, everything. Let's disappear, for real this time." He hesitated. "We'd have nothing." She smiled. "We already have everything we need." So they did. They packed 2 suitcases, left behind keys and names, took a train with no final destination. They changed their last names, rented a small house in a coastal town where no one knew them. She opened a small art studio. He taught business classes at a local school, and slowly the noise faded. There were still moments of fear, of doubt, of echoes from the life they left behind. But they learned to live in the quiet, to trust each other more than anything else. And one evening, under a sky full of stars, Gabriel asked her to marry him. No diamond, no photographers, just a silver ring shaped like a wave. She said yes. Years passed. They didn't become rich. They didn't return to the headlines. but they built something the Moretti Empire could never touch. A life, a love, a truth. One day, they walked past a newspaper stand. A headline read, "Moretti Empire crumbles as insider whistleblower exposes fraud." Gabriel smiled faintly. Isabella asked, "Do you miss it?" He looked at her. Not even a little. She took his hand, and together they walked on. Years had passed since Gabriel Moretti walked away from the world that once defined him. In their coastal town, no one called him sir. No one bowed to his name. He was just Gabriel, a teacher, a husband, a man who had once chosen love over legacy. And Isabella? She had bloomed. Her art studio had grown slowly but steadily. Local families brought their children to her for classes. Tourists admired her paintings, soft colors, quiet strength, raw emotion. Without saying it, her canvases told the story of a woman who had once been invisible and refused to stay that way. Their home was small, but full of warmth. Sunlight spilled over wooden floors. The air smelled of salt, paint, and coffee. There was no staff, no security guards, no boardrooms or glass towers, just mornings and music and peace. Until the letter arrived. It was delivered by hand. No return address. Just a wax seal pressed into thick paper. Gabriel found it on their doorstep one morning, resting on the welcome mat. He stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. Inside, a single sheet. One sentence. "Your father is dying." That night, Isabella found Gabriel sitting on their porch, holding the letter. His expression was unreadable. She sat beside him without speaking. After a long silence, he said, "I thought I'd feel something." She nodded. "Do you?" He looked out toward the sea. "I'm not sure." She placed her hand over his. "Then go. Not for him. For yourself." He turned to her. "Would you come with me?" She smiled gently. "Always." They packed a small bag and left before sunrise. The city hadn't changed much. Skyscrapers still cast shadows over the poor. Luxury still moved behind tinted windows. The Moretti building still loomed over the skyline like a crown. But Gabriel no longer belonged to it. Inside the private hospital, they were led down a corridor of silence and antiseptic light. Lorenzo Moretti lay in a private suite, thinner, paler, older. Machines hummed beside his bed, keeping time he could no longer control. He opened his eyes slowly when they entered. For a moment he said nothing, just stared at them, at the son who had walked away and the woman he'd tried to erase. Finally, he spoke. "I see you didn't disappear after all." Gabriel stood calmly. "No, I lived." Lorenzo's lips curled faintly. "At what cost?" "Only the parts of me that never belonged." There was a long pause. Lorenzo looked at Isabella. "You were never supposed to matter." She replied softly, "That's why I did." Gabriel didn't flinch. He stepped closer. "What do you want?" Lorenzo's eyes flickered. "Regret," he whispered. "It's a cruel thing." "Too late," Gabriel said. But then, to his own surprise, he added, "Still, I came." Lorenzo reached into a drawer beside the bed. He pulled out a small black notebook and placed it on the tray. "This is everything," he said. "The company's secrets, accounts, names that rot beneath the surface." Gabriel stared at it. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I built a kingdom of shadows," Lorenzo said, "and it's dying with me. Let it burn." Gabriel didn't take the notebook. Not yet. He turned to Isabella. She looked into his eyes, not with fear, but clarity. She said, "Maybe the only way to end his story is to expose it." Gabriel took the book. They didn't say goodbye. They just left. Outside, the city moved around them, oblivious. Back at their apartment by the sea, Gabriel spent the next few nights reading. The pages held confessions disguised as data, lies dressed as ledgers. deals that had destroyed lives in silence. Isabella watched him grow quiet again, but not with sorrow, with conviction. One morning, he closed the notebook and said, "We're going back? To the media?" she asked. He shook his head. To the people who were hurt. They contacted former employees. Small businesses buried by corporate theft. Families whose pensions were erased. Whistleblowers silenced. Gabriel gave them names. Evidence. The full truth. The scandal exploded. Moretti Enterprises collapsed in weeks. Investigations were launched. CEOs resigned. Lawsuits piled up. For the first time, the empire his father built stood exposed in daylight, raw and shaking. And Gabriel didn't hide. He stood in front of cameras, not as an heir, not as a victim, as a man who chose honesty. And as the world watched, something strange happened. People listened, not because of his last name, but in spite of it. And Isabella? She never left his side. Even as headlines screamed. Even as strangers recognized them on the street. Even as some begged him to rebuild the empire, now that the throne was empty. He always said the same thing. Power built on silence deserves to fall. Months passed. The scandal faded. The world moved on. And one morning, Gabriel and Isabella stood on the beach behind their home, feet in the sand, watching the tide pull away. He turned to her and asked, "Do you ever miss the elevator?" She laughed. "Sometimes," she said. "It was quiet there." "And honest," he added. She looked at him. "That's where I first saw you," she said. "Not the last name, not the suit, just you." He smiled. "And I saw you," he whispered, in a world that never bothered to look. They stood in silence for a long time. Two people who had risked everything and gained the only thing that mattered. Not money, not legacy, but freedom. Years later, no one spoke about the elevator anymore. The media had moved on. The headlines had faded. New scandals had replaced old ones, and the Moretti name had slipped quietly into history, not as royalty, but as a warning. But for Gabriel and Isabella, the story never truly ended. Because it wasn't just about a building, or a company, or a scandal. It was about who they became when everything else was stripped away. Their home by the sea had grown, not in size, but in soul. The little art studio now had apprentices. Local students displayed their work in the windows. Isabella never signed her paintings with her full name, just a small lowercase I in the corner. Humble, hidden, hers. Gabriel taught 5 days a week at the community center. Young people, some from troubled homes, some with dreams too big for their circumstances, sat in his classes not because of who he had been, but because of who he had chosen to become. He taught them about money, but more than that, he taught them how to recognize chains, even when they looked like opportunities. How to walk away from things that looked like success, but felt like poison. Sometimes after class, one of the students would ask him if the stories were true. If he was really the Gabriel Moretti, he would always pause before answering, then say, "I used to be. Now I'm just me." And that was enough. One afternoon, while organizing old files in a dusty box, Isabella found something she had almost forgotten. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. It was the note Gabriel had given her the day they first met outside the Moretti Tower, the one with the cafe address. The note that had changed everything. She smiled quietly, tracing the faded ink with her fingertips. When he came home that evening, she showed it to him. He held the paper for a long time, then said, "Funny how everything we are now started with that." She nodded. One choice. One moment. He folded the note back up, placed it in a small wooden box beside their bed, and said, "Let's never forget where we came from." She whispered, "We can't. It's who we are." That night, as they lay beside each other, A storm moved in across the ocean. Not the violent kind, just wind and distant thunder, the kind that hums more than it strikes. Gabriel stared at the ceiling. "There's something I never told you," he said softly. Isabella turned to him, curious. "That day in the elevator," he continued, "before it stopped, I had a meeting scheduled with a private security firm. My father wanted to push me into politics, to give the Moretti name more power. I was going to sign off on a surveillance contract that would have profited from fear." He looked at her. "If that elevator hadn't stopped, if you hadn't been there, I might have become him." She didn't speak at first. Then, gently, she said, "Maybe we saved each other." The rain tapped softly against the window. In the morning, the world felt clean again. Weeks later, a letter arrived. This time, not from the shadows, but from the light. It was from a girl named Luna 17, a student in one of Gabriel's weekend classes. She wrote, "I used to think the world was built to crush people like me, that I'd never be seen, that my dreams were too big for someone with a cleaning uniform and second-hand shoes. But then I heard your story, and I realized I'm not invisible. I'm just becoming. Thank you for showing me that worth isn't something we're born into. It's something we choose to protect." Gabriel showed the letter to Isabella. She read it twice, then quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. They pinned it to the wall above her art table, right next to a photo of the elevator. It was grainy, pulled from old security footage. A still frame of two people standing 6 feet apart, unaware that the rest of their lives were about to begin. One in a suit, one in a uniform, both lost, both about to be found. They never made a documentary about it. There was no movie deal, no best-selling memoir, just two lives, lived fully, and a love that refused to be small. Sometimes when tourists visited the gallery, they'd ask about the artist, about her inspiration, her story. Isabella would smile and say, "Once I got stuck in an elevator with a stranger, and I never left." At night, she and Gabriel would walk along the beach barefoot, waves lapping at their ankles, their hands always finding each other. And sometimes Gabriel would look out over the water and whisper, "We were never supposed to meet." And she'd reply, "That's why it mattered. Because in a world built to separate them, they had chosen each other anyway, not just once, but every single day after." And that, in the end, was their quiet revolution.